Good afternoon. For those of you who are online, we'll begin in about 2 minutes. Just waiting for a couple of more people to come in. Okay, I think we can start. And yeah, so good afternoon and welcome once again to a very interesting talk by Nitin Sinha. I'll introduce him in a moment. So, I mean, the reason this talk is interesting personally for me is the social historian of time is going to speak, and the philosopher historian of time is going to respond. Okay. So, Nitin is based at ZMO Berlin. I can't pronounce the German name in full. Yeah. And he's widely published on a range of themes dealing with transport, labor, ecology, law. At the moment, he's the principal investigator of an ERC-funded project, Timely Histories, a social history of time in early modern and modern South Asia. And more recently, as part of that project, but also independently, he's written a rather dense, though slim, thankfully, book titled Against the Fetishization of Plural Time, Rethinking Ways of Doing a Social History of Time. This is the book that he's going to speak on today. And the question that he asks are many there, but in a capsule, from what I could pick up, it's a struggle between thinking about time as independent of human actions, but also how humans make time, live in time, and do things with time, and how that plays out. Our discussant is Prathama Banerjee, Professor Prathama Banerjee, based at CSDS, author of numerous articles and some books. Her book titled Politics of Time, Primitives and History Writing in a Colonial Society was published by OUP some time back. And more recently, she has published Elementary Aspects of the Political History from the Global South, which came out from the Duke University Press. So without further ado, Nitin, about 40, 45 minutes, and Prathama about 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll open it to the house.
Thank you, Deepu. I'll just share the screen now. Yeah. Okay. I think I wasn't this nervous as I am today when I had applied for this project. First of all, thanks to all the members, the current as well as the previous members of the Timely Histories project. This project started in 2021 and it is going to end next year in June. So we were very fortunate to have a diverse sort of set of people, researchers, scholars, with whom we were constantly brainstorming. So many of the ideas which are there in this book have emerged actually from that collective discussion. Of course, I don't attribute any blame on my friends and colleagues for the credit can go to them. So yeah, it emerges out of a kind of a collective thinking around the issue of time and temporality. So I will start with certain caveats. The first one is the very accidental journey of this book, which was never planned to be a book. I started writing this as a very as a provocative block piece, provocation in the sense that while doing certain like readings and scholarships which exist, particularly on the making of modern time, there was a sense of uneasiness which I was feeling. And then I thought that I'll just put it out in a blog as a kind of provocation. Then it was read by some people, including Professor Prathama. And then it kept on expanding and expanding to the point where it reached an article length, kind of 8,000, 10,000 word limit thing. And then so and again it was like again discussed in our group, and then I was also not happy with some of parts, not that I'm still happy with the final product. But then it became a journey. Also, I felt that writing was helping me clarify a lot of things, and I do think that as a researcher, writing is very, it's not that the ideas are already there in the brain and we just pour them out on the paper. Writing is actually an act of creating arguments and understanding your own limitations and how do you go about them. So that's how it kept on growing. So it became uh, from blog to book kind of a journey this book had. But very simple historiographical questions which I had in mind while doing the readings is first, uh, one set of scholarship I felt was using time as a proxy to explain historical periodization and the prevalence of historical consciousness. And so I say it with great sincerity that my points of disagreements or refinements in the existing scholarship is not coming from any point of dismissal, but I'm just trying to go for like go move a little forward with them, and also picking up what gaps perhaps there were which I'm trying to plug in. So in this broad historiography, like if we take into South Asian historiography, we had debates on what either time is cyclical or linear. That kind of debate was there. Then I remember we did readings of Professor Mukhia's writings on, historical. So time was appearing as a kind of a marker of periodization, a kind of a functional representative of social and economic conditions. Um, Also beyond South Asia. So I remember in 2022, when we had done our first workshop on early modern temporalities, a lot of time was spent by scholars from whom we have all benefited, like Daud Ali, Margaret Perna, Abhishek Kakar. We all were talking at that time that how feasible or how valid is the category of early modern per se. So temporal categorization as working as a marker of periodization as to what is the relationship between past, present, and future, how they have changed over a period of time. So one set of scholarship on time deals with the politics of periodization, if I may say. And I was also always feeling that yes, this is important for us to know and understand, but where is time as a social constituent which shapes social relationships? And we will come to that later. The second thing which I was feeling, particularly in the scholarship on making of the modern time, that its making was often traced through the histories of those institutions and technologies, and at those sites and locations which in their genesis are already marked by the ascriptive values of modernity. Mechanical clock, factory, industry, railways, tramways, telegraph, telephone, school, office, and army are some of the usual suspects. These sites and locations then yield the results that historians expect of them, either to confirm their overwhelming contribution to the making of the modern time, or to discover the mix of conflictual processes of the coexistence of various tempos. So reflection, like reflecting the worlds of the modern and the pre-modern coming together, that kind of argument. So I felt that we have reached a point in this exploration of the making of the modern time that we can with some certainty already predict which sites and locations will be chosen by scholars for investigating the making of the modern time. So I felt there was a kind of a circularity there. We know that these sites and locations are modern, and then we go to explore the making of the modern times. So it looked a little, it's a kind of a circular logic there, it appeared. The third, which I felt in this very broad kind of survey and reading and attempt to understand, which was not always very easy, that there was a very kind of a formulaic would be the wrong word, but perhaps you get that sense that there was a very formulaic movement, that time was fluid in the pre-modern period, then time became abstract and linear in the modern period, then there were impetus from different schools of thoughts, particularly say post-colonial thought or global history thought, that modern time also then became plural. So it was a journey from fluid pre-modern to abstract and linear modern, and then time becoming fluid again. So um, again, very rich history and historiography exists on this, but it left me with some easiness that it is a bit too neat to be not true, too neat to, like if we already know the patterns and we just have to map our own historical research on that, then how do we go about that? Particularly when we came to the period of modern time, I felt that we encounter a lot of binaries in which the making of the modern time has been written. We get to know that, again, pre-modern time was elastic, and there's a movement from elasticity to fixity. Then there's a movement from non-linear to linear, lived and abstract. And what I realized, or what my impression was, that while time is getting characterized in all these movements, uh, it was also becoming the host or the site to classify the societies itself. So some societies will be classified as traditional, and some as modern, some as Western, some as non-Western. So while time is under exploration, time itself becomes the conduit of new forms of classification. Um, and yeah, so let me come to the limitations of my own work and scholarship. Uh, Maybe I'm also trying to fend myself from the varied questions which are going to emerge later. I have no uh, I have no competence to talk about time in terms of what time is. I think that is best left to the disciplines of perhaps physics or philosophy. I don't have any competence in these two disciplines. So for me, I mean, we do know certain basic principles which we have now about time. So time is, relative. We know that time passes faster in the mountains than at the sea level. We do know that time passes more slowly for the one who keeps moving. So these are facts coming from the discipline of physics, but um, I hold absolutely no competence to go further than this in terms of thinking of what time is. For me, it is important that the way I was thinking about it, that I turned it into a question of I turned it into a historical question of what happens when time becomes an element of social relationship, finds itself embedded in uneven equations of power, and how does it become a resource of command and dispute between people. I'm interested in the question of what people did with and in time. I approach these questions of with and it through empirical investigations of people and their practices. So here I'm trying, in the third chapter of the book, I try to actually bring in a lot of empirical understandings of the kind of the work which I have done on law or transport, and trying to think of my own sort of, what I'm proposing in this book through empirical substantiation. Um, I in no way am suggesting that archives or particular this kind of state-oriented documents are the only. I don't think I need to defend here, at least in this room, that there are various types of archives and people should man different types of archives. But here my idea is that social history of time, the way I'm thinking, um, has empirical grounding. Um, So one of the questions which came, which I started confronting while writing this book was that, is there actually a difference between doing a history of social time or doing a social history of time? And that is something I have spent a bit in the book. The idea of social time is, of course, and I will confess that I'm here very, I not influenced, but I borrow a lot from Alfred Gell's book, The Anthropology of Time, where he very systematically discusses all the early 20th century writers, particularly anthropologists, on what is their notion of social time. Uh, so in a way, this first I'll just lay out what this book is doing before coming to this idea of social time. So this book raises three interlinked questions. First, how to do a social history of time. Second, what are the ways in which it can be done without succumbing to the usual and at times inevitable pull of some of the useful binaries in which most of the historical accounts of time have been written. And third, how, as a result of overcoming some of these binaries, do we go beyond simply stating the fact that time or temporality is plural and multiple when it is approached as a socially constituted entity? So, social times, so this literature is quite vast. If I can really brutally summarize it, this emerged out of understanding that time as is a rhythm. It's an outcome of a rhythm of social collective life based on rites and rituals and religion. Then it also emerges from the social act of timing. And social time is something which is not, of course, not individual, but not also independently natures. It's just bridge between the individual and the nature, which is, but the whole idea is that, at least in a set of literature, that time is eternally social, which means that even if we are calculating time from the celestial movements, and there are broadly three types of movements which are used. One is the rotation of the earth on its axis, the second is the revolution of the earth around the sun, and third is the revolution of the moon around the earth. These three broad, but the argument here, some scholars have made that they can only be calculated through social systems of notations. And so the social is the inevitable interface of translating natural time into our practices. So that's why time is eternally social. Uh, while it is true and it is a dominant trend in the scholarship, I feel that it has also led is to give a bit of an easy handle to argue that time is eternally plural as well, because the domain of the social is a differentiated, variegated uh, formation. So if time is a social construct and its meanings is only discerned through social practices and relationships, then it is bound to be plural. Um, uh, it has also, at least in this set of literature, it also reinforced the binary mode of explanation, again, the coming back of the primitive and the modern, primitive or advanced, and so on. So there were some problems there. But the larger question which I had in mind is that if we already know that time is plural, then how far can we go on repeating it ad infinitum? Where do we go from here? Once we have, even if we accept that time is plural, where do we go from here? And that's where I started thinking of, is a social history approach is going to help us move forward. A history of social time or a history of historiography and historicity is not the subject matter of this monograph. Time becoming a constituent of social relationship and power hierarchy, that is in my understanding at least, that is where I'm trying to get at. By foregrounding people and their practices to the forefront of our research, I wish to push the idea that a social history of time can be imagined in terms of investigating what people do with and in time. People interact with time to turn it into a resource to exercise power, or to turn it into a resource of power. People do things with time and thus create possibilities of multiple forms of engagement with time. They slot it, they document it, they catalog it, they conquer it. In contrast, people act in time because time retains its pre-given character, which exerts its own authority in how social groups attain and resist that power. People do things with time and in the course of doing give meaning to it. But people are also constrained by the universality of time, such as bodily degradation or planetary movements causing day and night, which they may socially explain in a varied manner, but may not control, reverse, or collapse it in any absolute sense. Therefore, they are forced to act in time, which is independent of human action, while they simultaneously interact with time to make it their own. Practices shape meanings of time, but they also happen within the matrix of time, which is not often mutable. Multiple forms of engagement with time do not make time itself multiple or plural. I propose to locate the stuff of social history as resolutely pursed between this constant traffic of practices with and in time. As a historian, the way I think of social time is not to be confused with psychosubjective time. Perception and narrativization of time at the personal and experiential levels are part of historical investigation. But still, for me, social time is inherently historically constituted and is public in nature, even if reconstituted at the site of the private and experienced at the level of the self. I approach social time as constituted through the politics of control and subversion, whose making is filtered through concrete histories of law, technology, power, capital, divinity, and ecology, and how people's everyday and every night practices shaped them. Thus, the element of subjective experience is present, but as one which is a part of a collective interactive process and not atomized at the level of experience. The social, as used in this historical sense of practices across spaces and peoples, thus interrogates the processes that make time a social component of order and power, of livelihood and relationships. It also examines those factors that constantly act upon such practices, which questions and subvert them and open new pathways of temporal sociability, which leads to shifts in temporal regimes and temporal cultures. A social history of time thus needs to historicize temporalities embedded in factors that constitute power relationships, as well as historicize the relationship between those temporalities itself as they operate within the larger matrix of time. So I'm heavily influenced by the way Sumit Sarkar has described the modalities of social history, particularly in a lecture given in Goldsmith in 2007, where he really, in the beginning of the lecture, lays out what social history means to him. And this quote is from that lecture. My methodology here is like social history, combination of social history, micro history, everyday history, where we can actually get to see the oddity and the mundaneness, things which we otherwise tend to ignore or are not instantly visible or easily visible. So just to look at those practices which are little odd. And also I suggest in the book, but this is something I'm not going to elaborate upon here, is that the new kind of a new social history must take into account the newer researches, particularly coming in the field of the interspecies relationships. And there, it's a kind of a very sketchy summary which I provide in the book. But to me, it appears that the idea of justice is something which works both in the histories of the Anthropocene as well as has been a very dominant cornerstone of the social history framework. So that idea of justice is there. There is something in that which can connect and expand the limits of the imagination of new social history. One thing which then needs to be said, and this also came up last week in our workshop here, that there are indeed intermixed temporalities. Now, if I can just give a quick example of if I have to write a history of boatmen in late 18th and 19th century, I will start with what I would call ecological temporality. I will look at in which seasons, in which monsoons, and which seasons, and in which months there is shifting water volume, which is directly affecting the condition of work by boatmen. I will look at tides and flows of everything related to that, what we understand at natural time or time getting, or as nature working, not as a fabric, not as a background fabric, but actually interacting with the work rhythm, how they are setting the rhythms of work. So I will look at that. Then I will also look at the legal temporality, how law as an state institution started shaping the working conditions of these people. Then I would also look at, it was very popular, and boatmen, I think, were one of the few working groups in the late 18th century who successfully insisted on having advance payment. Suppose so they are starting their journey from Calcutta to Patna or to Benares, and they would get at least 50% of their wages in advance, because their argument was that we are leaving our families behind, so we need money to take care of our families. That incidentally became, at least in the colonial logic, the reason for their continuous mutiny, because now they have received the advances, so they can desert easily while they are on the river. So there is a logic of this, what I would call a kind of a money-based temporality, which is when are the advances given, when are the wages given, and so I will look at different temporalities. I look at ecological, I would look at legal, I will look at monetary, and so on. So intermixed temporalities is a thing, is a way to go about doing our research. But sometimes I feel that once intermeshing is has been demonstrated, the quick resolution is that time is plural. The coming of different temporalities start telling something, doing to our mind in thinking of, okay, time itself is a plural entity. And that is where I start seeing problems. At least I feel there could be other ways of actually doing this. So when social time is approached through intermixed layers of various constituents, which seemingly are of contradictory ascriptions, then a rich social history of modern time can be produced by mapping the changing matrix of these constituents over a period of time. However, to an extent, such histories will perhaps remain ever captive to twin analytical modes of analysis. One, it may inevitably produce historical accounts based upon transfer, diffusion, circulation framework, particularly in the case of colonial societies, even if the scope of the framework is articulated in a highly sophisticated manner. And two, the account may present a narrative of incremental progressive intrusion and the adaptation of new devices such as mechanical clock, railways, telegraph, etc., either leading to uneven uniformity or the creation of counter tempo. So this was the question which came up in our workshop also, that when bullock carts and railways come together, do we think in absolute terms of transition, that a new time or a new time sensibility has come, or we think in an intermixed thing? And mostly, sometimes historically it is important and right to think in intermixed manner, but sometimes then people start calling it that, oh, time itself is a plural entity. Intermixed temporalities will of course make use of the framework of pluritemporality, but the latter should serve as an entry point to explore the social and not become the end harvest to demarcate the social. This entails stopping the treating of the practices of the past either as residues or resistant expressions of essentialized cultural baggage. There is nothing inevitable about modern time. It is a product of historical tension and conflict, and the locale of conflicting forces within the practices of the social needs to be historically established without invoking the frameworks of nativity or indigeneity. So one of the findings of my book on the transport was that with the coming of the steam engine, there was a proliferation in the use of bullock carts. So I didn't see it as a kind of the two times coming together, but actually it can be seen as a slow mutation of a new a slow emergence of a new temporal regime in which the earlier practices are getting synced or segmented. So the fact that the bullock carts proliferated was also a kind of a modern simultaneous instantiation as steam engines came in use. in terms of temporality, they did exhibit different registers of speed, but they both operated and slowly synced as well in one time frame. So so I have proposed in the book that, and this is just a proposal. It is not like it. So I have suggested that we should think of temporal regime and temporal cultures. By that, I mean in a very, I would say rather in a schematic manner, which I have elaborated with empirical substantiations, that by regime, what I understand is a kind of a web of interlocked structures and institutions which shape people's relationship with time. It demands a closer exploration of institutional setup and material context. For me, temporal culture is a rather broad field, a substantive way of studying society's engagement with time through those features and characteristics in which time-oriented actions get defined. So here, in my mind, at least, I'm like, if I have to do the history of speed, comfort, boredom, delay, I would do it under this rubric of temporal culture. But constantly, so I'm not posing any causal relationship between temporal regime and temporal culture, but I'm suggesting that both should be done together, whereas regimes signifies a more institutional mechanism in which of technology or law in which changes can be a little quicker. The area of temporal culture can be where changes adapt and mutate at a little slower pace. So yeah, so I'll just read this part out. A temporal regime is constituted by how people dealt with technique and technologies, with law and authority, with seasons, nature, and the flow of money, with science, divinity, and other animate and inanimate beings and objects. That is, with the structures of livelihood and power in which life is situated or was situated. In contrast to this and complementing this, the institutional structure and structural scope of a temporal regime, a temporal culture, on the other hand, can be a substantive way of studying society's engagement with time. So, as I said, accuracy, speed, punctuality, leisure, delay, waiting, boredom, and other such terms through which the passage of time and people's actions in it are recorded and registered, judged and valued. That would compromise one part of it. In a loose manner, temporal culture can be a set of practices that indicate how temporal regime was experienced. Now, coming to why I call it the fetishization of the plural time. I mean, I have indicated earlier that working through those binaries of where the pre-modern time is treated as fluid and modern as fixed, and then again that modern has been revisited to make it further fluid. So this is and a lot of recent scholarship actually demonstrate or argue for that. For instance, Sebastian Conrad's argument is that hegemony of modern time was not absolute, so we need to keep thinking in terms of plural time. Or Margaret Pernow's argument that that is like the past and the present and the future are all in embroiled state. And this has also been sort of given a spurt by this fading belief in the universal idea and trajectory of progress and future. So basically, there are multiple times. For me, it feels like it is a quick methodological solution to the problem of the binaries, just because we face this problem of the binary and we see that there are intermixed temporalities in whatever we are investigating as historian. So let's call it plural and get done with that. So I think there's a bit of, it's a quick methodological solution. To an extent, I feel that it has almost become an article of faith rather than an outcome of empirical research. For me, plurality of social time is the point of where I would begin my research from and not end there. So one of the questions which really animated, like which really troubled me, and I don't know if I have managed to answer it properly, is that do multiple forms of engagement with and in time make time itself plural? And that is the question I posed to myself while writing this. So I'll just read the Shouldn't be reading this much. How much time do I? Huh? 10 minutes, okay. A social history of time could begin by deeply historicizing the apparent contradictory forces of socio-economic and cultural lives, which are temporally constituted. But then the question arises, what do we do when after deep historicization, the knotted pattern of intermixed temporalities or the coexistence of multiple systems of time notation, plural time experiences, and multiple habitations of and in time have been discovered and explained? Usually it has led to the argument that time is plural or multiple. If plurality is an axiomatic truth, then should our intellectual labor be restricted only to establishing the extent, degree, and scope of plurality through the act of historicization? From multiple experiences of time, we reach the conclusion of multiplicity of time. In contrast to this, let us ponder what it would mean to do a social history of time uh, instead of history of social time. While unpacking this question for myself, it appears to me that one can argue that time potentially can be treated as a universal entity, at least for developing a research hypothesis. Its rendition as a social entity then is related not to what time is, but what people did with and in it. Uh, I wish to emphasize to think of time as a linear universal entity, purely as a thought aid to help us do social history beyond reinventing the wheel of plurality and multiplicity of time. This does not mean that if time is conceptualized as a linear universal entity, it is naturally laden with ideas of it being gradually progressivist or developmentalist. Linearity does not necessarily need to be thought of in terms of a progressive unitary mode of movement of humankind in one direction, akin to the idea of progress. Linearity could simply mean the non-reversibility of time. The reversibility of time and recurrence of events do not mean the same thing. That is, events when recurring or appearing to recur do not necessarily mean that time has reversed. A social history of time approach that starts with the premise that time can be treated as a singular resource, which when it becomes part of social life creates ground for differentiation. In this view, the history of time is not the outcome of the intellectual labor behind the effort to historicize time. Time is not its own object of research. Histories of people and their practices, preferably at the interspecies level, in which time is interlaced as a resource of historical action, are. A social history of time is neither limited to the history of time nor to the history of historicity. More than worrying about time's inherent characteristic, a social history of time approach clearly accentuates practices. It will then seek to unravel the power behind the plurality of practices. While practices may appear autonomous or their nature of interconnections as uneven, which may render time appear plural, the necessity of understanding the mechanism of power requires that the temporal fabric in which they unfold and create synergies and divisions is taken to be unitary. A singular universal notion of time is imperative to the prospect of investigating the dynamics of social relationships. If seen in this way, the work of historical intellectual labor will be geared more towards charting the processes through which the temporalization of social relationships occurred in any period of study rather than the temporalization of time itself. The romance with plurality is also partly political in nature. For a long time, it was believed, and is still so, that modernity has straightened time. Hence, the pre-modern period must appear to us plural. Further, when the Eurocentric basis behind the logic of the straightened time began to be questioned, the global convergence was unpacked to reinsert plurality into time. And hence goes the argument. So goes the argument. Yes, there was Western hegemony and imposition, but it was neither absolute nor entirely subsuming of other practices. These other practices resisted and forced the unitary European model to adapt itself. Global forces gave birth to local conditions, but the local also forced the global to retreat and reform. Hence, we see plurality. The problem is that plurality is not only a recourse of the resistant and the marginal, but has also remained a point of justification for the powerful in the past. In other words, power also creates or at least discursively organizes time in plural ways. How are we then to account for such plural temporal paths? Colonial history is replete with such examples. Colonialists argued that Indians lived in a different temporal order, shaped by slowness and superstition, which is why the full fledged Western civility of law or technology was not suitable for them. On what basis can we call their use of pluritemporality fake and ridden with power, and ours as loaded with the possibility of a radical rereading of the past? These are the parts of the conclusion which are deliberately polemical as well. They argued that natives were a slumbering lot before the whistle of the railways awakened or forced them to value time. We surely cannot take this plural temporal representation, undergirded by political and cultural power of imperialism, at its face value. Colonizers lived in the temporality of acceleration. The colonized were wrapped in the oasis of status. This is not my argument, this is the representation. The colonized were consigned to the waiting room of history precisely because the colonizers found time and its plurality to be a significant order of justification. It is evident that colonial plurality was designed to perpetuate hierarchies, whereas the new scholarly plurality is for radical equality. However, the latter also, in a discomforting manner, propagates the idea of discrete, autonomous, and fragmented units or formations of temporality, which potentially relativizes and atomizes time. There is obviously a need to divest time of any ethnocentric values that create orders and hierarchies amongst people and cultures in any intrinsic manner. But in order to decouple time from the idea of linear progress, we do not need to relativize time and through its idiomatic use, fetishize the past in turn, to the extent that the social unevenness of the past begins to take refuge in the plural formation of time. Time must remain in our conceptualization an anchor and a host of change and transformation. The temporal scale of comparison ought to be linear and unitary in order to write the histories of disposition, and how time as a social constituent helped in creating this divide. A heavy culturalization and relativization of time in current studies is limiting in its scope. Multiple perceptions, plural engagements, and the intermeshing of various types and methods of time notation and time experience can still and must be mapped while assuming time to be non-plural. The framework of plurality might lead us to relativize and atomize time and power to such an extent that the ensuing temporal regimes and cultures will always appear as fractured sovereign entities, incommensurable for historians to firmly locate the interconnected processes of changed continuities and continuous change. They will appear well secured in their respective domains of the exercise of power without being dominant or hegemonic over each other. What shall the independent itemized plural times be measured to and against? To make power commensurable, accountable, historical, and comparable between individuals, cultures, societies, and practices, which is a mode of history writing, time should be treated as non-teleological but a non-plural entity, while always questioning the location and impulse through which the multiple forms of engagement with it continuously unfold. Given the current planetary and social crises, of which the global warming and global authoritarianism are the two most pressing ones, treating time at least as a universal placeholder is not that outrageous an ask. Plurality in time is an outcome of practices and their historicization. Plurality of time can become a significant empty statement. Thank you.